effectively. Hopefully each week we're going to bring you different topics, maybe different guests. Wherever you are, we want you to please subscribe, like, share this information. It really is a huge help to us. So if you're on YouTube or Spotify or Google Play or iTunes, anywhere else, Tony, did I miss anything there?
Facebook,
if you're there, please like us, subscribe, share it. It's it takes a few seconds on your end, but it's a huge help to our ministry and to getting the ministry out there. And so we're glad that you are with us. Tony, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great today, Chris. It's one of those days where it seemed like a lot got done, but I felt like I got nothing done at the same time.
I don't like those days.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
That would describe my day. I did a lot, and yet I don't think I can actually cross much off of my list.
Right. So you just work really hard on things that didn't get completely done.
But I do feel good. I had a good day.
Yeah, good. That's great.
Okay.
I'm excited to be on the air.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was hitting that afternoon, like I was just like, I am tired.
Oh yeah.
And then like, oh, but we're gonna do a show. We're gonna do a podcast today. And now all of a sudden I feel energized. I have my Diet Coke. I'm good.
Yeah. Tonight I have to get ready to take family pictures tonight. That should be fun.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, anyone who has large families knows this pain. I have a feeling that there's a lot of people out there like, oh, we get to take family pictures. And I never, ever think that. Like, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, which kid is going to ruin every single one of these pictures?
Right.
Or which kids? Because it's like different ones in different photos. Oh, it's annoying.
Yeah. We had an experience like that, even within our parish directory, that we were taking a whole series of family pictures. And all the way through, the photographer was like, oh, great picture. And we got them all back. And in every one of them, one of my daughters was making a pirate face.
Hold on. It was just the same daughter?
Yes.
Making the pirate face.
Uh-huh. And he didn't say anything. Like the photographer didn't go, hey, by the way, your daughter's making a pirate face right now. I was like, this is
Tony,
not
to
funny.
me, there's two pains in this process. I actually say three pains. First of all, it's the pain of getting dressed up and deciding, are we going to do all the same color, right? Or is there some theme, or are we just going to wear whatever we got on and let's go show up?
I
right?
don't even have to think about that because my wife decides that
Right.
7 days ahead, and if she doesn't have it already decided 7 days ahead, she's stressed out
Right.
until the
So there's
moment.
that first pain, and then there's the second pain of actually taking the photo, right? Of getting everyone to sit down, and if there's a baby at that moment, of them not crying, right? And so there's the pain of taking, and then, and to me this may be the worst one, there's the pain of choosing the photo, at which that point I just walk out and go, I'll go take these kids outside and watch them.
That way you can concentrate.
Right, because I'm just like, no, we're all in it. We're good. Use that one.
Right.
We're all in it. Go. I don't. Yeah, but this one's making a pirate face. I don't care. She's in it.
She's making a pirate face in all of them.
Right.
Welcome to the church directory.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
You're not going to rat the kid out, are you?
No,
That's
but you
very
should
fair.
know because we went from that picture take or that shoot straight to your house to drop off all the kids.
Oh, okay.
And we had finally collected ourselves back to like not being overly upset at that time.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, good luck with that tonight.
Thank you.
So what do we? But before that, what are we going to talk about on today's podcast? Besides prepping people of how to take
large family photo
yes.
shoots.
Yes,
right?
we got that down.
Well, today we're going to talk about how you and I, we actually have no new material, and the reality is that I don't think there is any new material in the world. I think that everything is kind of like redigested, maybe re-emphasized, or use. People use different forms of different ideas, but I don't know that there's a new idea out there in general because it's always just kind of just a reusing of old material. And to kind of demonstrate that point, I wanted to use Aristotle, the ancient philosopher.
That's going back a ways.
Aristotle as our methodology for contemporary evangelization. And so we're going to look at the way that he described and the way what he taught and how to argue, how to have these conversations in a way that is convincing, that is real, that is available, that actually succeeds in winning arguments against people that maybe very much disagree with what we believe. But how do we go about that art of argumentation, and why is it nothing new now? I think that when we use Aristotle's methodology, we'll realize that, man, that we still are doing the same kind of things. We just have to have reminders.
So what you're talking about, though, is that we're going to take something that's really old and apply it in a new way to evangelization. So this stuff is brand new, is what you're saying.
It's brand new.
Because
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if we should be telling the people listening that we have nothing new for them.
Well, I don't think anyone does. So
we might need to go edit that out of.
That's okay.
We're just going with it. We're going with
Aristotle.
He's brand new. Aristotle.
So with Aristotle, in his art of argumentation, what we call the Aristotelian art of argumentation, he really gives three ways by which we convey the truth. And the first is logos, the second is pathos, and the third one is ethos. And logos, pathos, and ethos are kind of building blocks. One builds upon the other. You have to have the first in order to get to the second. If you have the second without the first, then it means nothing. And so we're going to start with the first, with this logos, and move from there into what specifically are we trying to accomplish. We can use examples, but the reality is we're really looking at it from a really high-end perspective of what is it that we're trying to do and how are we trying to do it, regardless of the concept that we're trying to convey. So we're going to start with logos, Chris.
Logos.
Yeah,
word.
Logos. Word. So this is a Latin word, obviously, or that really is this idea of the word, but it's where we get the word logic. And this idea of logic or this logos, according to Aristotle, was something that was intended and directed toward the idea of convincing. So you're trying to make a logical argument to convince someone. Now, when I say logical, I think that a lot of times those who maybe have not taken philosophy or not taken logic, those used to be required in high schools and in colleges. Not so much anymore, and people misuse the word logic now. But when I say logical, I actually do mean like actual logistical, syllogistic perspectives of reality. So you're using sentences that connect to one another in order to end at an actual conclusion that is undeniable because of the logical truth that's within it.
Yeah, I think something to me when I think of logos that you were just describing, even how you said it, this is like the content of what we're going to discuss with somebody else.
Right.
And so when I think of the content that you're going to discuss with somebody else, we have to begin, like, for instance, with definitions. Like you said it yourself, we use the word logic, but not really in its traditional sense, right? And so we need to understand what we mean. And so much to me, when we begin to argue in today's culture, which I would say is usually negative. People think, oh, let's not get into an argument.
Right.
That's a negative thing, right? We're going to lose our tempers and people are going to get mad and offended and we're going to leave the room. But that's not what it certainly meant to Aristotle. Right? To be able to argue means like, let's sit down and discuss, like with, again, this logos, this logic. And that to me means that we're going to have to begin with terms and definitions.
Right.
And so much misunderstanding can be done away with when we talk about terms and definitions.
Now, what do you mean by that? What specifically does that word actually mean, and how is it used?
Well, that's what I mean by that.
It is what you mean by that. It's very logical.
Yes.
But the other issue to me within logic is that there's a difference between logical fallacy and logical validity. And I think that it's very interesting. Let me give you an easy example. I always use.
drop some
This
examples on
okay.
us here.
This is an easy one, right? So you might start with a statement that says all swans are white, and
All
then
swans are
all
white.
swans are
Yes.
white. The second is this thing is a swan. So therefore, this thing is
White.
white. That is a valid logistical statement.
One follows from the next.
And,
And you come to the
there's no
conclusion.
excluded middle,
Right.
and you come to a conclusion based on actual affirmative statements. However, it's a false statement because not all swans are white. So it's a valid logical syllogism that uses a false statement. So I think that a lot of times when we're in the midst of argumentation, we get caught up in the validity of the argument, or we get caught up in the fallacy of the argument. And one or the other, and the person is trying to make the statement that all swans are white, or that this thing is a swan, or this thing is white, whatever it is, what part are they trying to argue? And we get caught up in that because one person's arguing fallacy and the other one's arguing validity. And I think that in order for us to, if we have proper definitions, we have truth, we have to begin with truth, then we must follow with valid arguments. And those arguments need to be, they're not based on emotion. They're based on simple, truthful statements that follow one from another. And I think that that's the whole point is that when we're arguing these objections, that in order to refute these objections, it's almost like we have to identify where the confusion was. Where was the fallacy, or where was the excluded middle term? Where did the validity break down? If you start with a bad premise, all swans are white, then you're going to end with a false or not necessarily true conclusion. And in the same way, when we're talking to whether it's an atheist or a person of a different religion or our Protestant brethren, then the reality is that a lot of times they're starting with an invalid or an untrue beginning statement in which they follow all the way through and they come up with a solid, convicted statement that they believe to be true as true can be, but they started with an idea that was false to begin with. It was a misconception. It was maybe because of their own ignorance, maybe because they haven't researched enough, maybe they haven't read it from the catechism or from the Bible. Maybe they heard it from a pastor or somebody taught them wrong. But regardless of where it started, you can still go through and have a valid argument, but it started with a false premise and therefore ends with a false argument.
That's heavy. Could you give us another, and maybe before we go into break, even another example of how this plays out, if you will, with something that we do discuss, or like for instance, in a Christian realm, do you have an example of how this would look for us in more of a normal conversation, not swans?
Not swans.
Because to me, I think it seems like today that not only do we many times just go with a false premise, but many times we lack the ability to even think through these things. Like no one, because so much of our truth, at least what an individual holds to be true, is really just based on their feelings. Like this, I just feel like this is right, right? This it pleases me, really, is what they're saying. Like that truth, really, it pleases me, so that's why it's true. But really, to me, they don't have that ability to logically think through something, to go to that, to even those steps that you pointed out, that they're white, all swans are white, and then that next step that this is a swan, therefore this thing is white. But do you have any other examples that we could use right before we go here in about maybe a minute and a half here?
Well, I'm actually drawing a blank right now. But there's a countless number of examples that, whether it's a Protestant Catholic argument or that if you say that prayer only belongs to God, would be an example. Prayer only belongs to God. We should only pray to God, and Jesus is God. Therefore, we pray to Jesus.
Yeah.
But Mary is not God, and the saints are not God. Therefore, we should not pray to the saints.
Right. That's a great one.
So that logically follows that if prayer only belongs to God, and the saints and Mary are not God, then we should not be praying to saints. That is an actual valid conclusion
It would make sense.
within
right.
the premise that all prayer belongs to God. But it starts with a false premise that all prayer belongs to God, because what is prayer?
Exactly.
Again, you have to go back to what is the definition of
Right.
the word. So what is the definition of the word? A spiritual communication, an offering, just simply a communication with those who are in heaven. And if that is the definition of prayer, as opposed to, say, worship is the definition of prayer, or some other idea of how you want to define prayer, if you define prayer as simply being the communication of our communication with those spiritually in heaven, then why couldn't I then communicate
Right.
with those in heaven that are not God, like Mary or the saints?
But if prayer is worship, right? If that's the only understanding I have of prayer is that it is worship, then that is something that only belongs to God. But we would never define prayer as only as worship. That
Right.
is a type of worship. I mean, worship can be prayer.
Well, adoration, there are
Right.
different types of prayer,
Exactly.
even adoration,
but
supplication.
petition is a prayer.
Mhm.
And I can actually do that with you.
Right. I'll ask you to pray for me, and that's
Pray you pass me the beans at the table. We don't use that expression anymore, but I've seen it used in movies way long ago.
But even
okay?
if you went so far as to say intercessory prayer,
Right.
If I said, "Hey, will you pray for my family?"
Yep.
I'm asking you, another person, to pray for me. That's intercession. And do we have the ability to have intercession with the saints? Of course we can.
Right. Well, let's
So-
go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back and we'll finish up logos and then get into the next step as well. So we'll be right back. This is Casting Nets with Tony and Chris.
If you're searching for more tools to fill your evangelization tackle box, then visit Casting Nets Ministries at www.castingnetsonline.com. There are audio CD sets available, such as Evangelization, Why Not? This series on evangelization gives the real essentials for effectively sharing your faith. Or The Gift, Change Yourself, Change the World. In this series, Tony and Chris discuss the 3 pillars of the spiritual life: prayer, almsgiving, and fasting, in light of the new evangelization. And the newest series, The World's Strongest Men. Tony and Chris challenge men to be the best men, striving to live heroic virtue, therefore changing the world around them. You can also pick up your Casting Net shirt to become a walking advertisement for the new evangelization, with a great quote from Pope Benedict XVI. Don't forget to order your packet of Quick Cast to encourage evangelization. There are new resources being added all the time, so be sure to get them all at www.castingnetsonline.com, your resource for the new evangelization. Keep casting your nets out into the deep.
Back to Casting Nets with Tony and Chris. I am Chris Stewart here with Tony Brandt, and today we are going way back, a throwback, back to even before Jesus, and that is with the Aristotle's argument for art for argumentation. And Tony introduced this to us, but we still probably need to finish up. Any other thoughts on the first part of this, being able to argue and convince somebody of logos?
Well, I think to finish that up is just that we have to start with truth. And I think that's what Aristotle was searching for. That's exactly what Aristotle was trying to bring about in argumentation, that the goal is to convince them, or for me to be humble enough to accept the truth. And we can't do that without logic. And that logos is that art of being able to have a conversation that allows for a very clear, distinct understanding of truth. So using words to move all the way through it until we get to truth. That is the base. And if the other 2 levels don't mean anything if we don't start with valid truths that are being explained clearly and consistently.
Yeah, I would just add, so many times in our conversations, for instance, with our Protestant brothers and sisters, that this clearing up of definitions or terms or what we believe, like when somebody says, Catholics worship Mary, Well, that we don't. Right? That's where I'd want to begin. This is not what we do. Or, or Catholics think the Pope is sinless because you think he's infallible. No, that's not what we mean. You think that the Pope, can't ever speak anything incorrectly. No, that's not what infallibility means. It's a very limited term as to what that means, so we can clarify that. Or, I think so many times, even with atheists, Tony, when they say, I don't believe in a God, well, to me, it's almost becomes like, well, which God is it that you don't believe in?
Right.
Because most likely they have a caricature of what we mean by God. And we have to then come and define, well, could this be possible? This kind of being that I actually believe in, not just some old man with a big white beard, smiting and smoting those who displease him, right? That's not the God I believe in. If that was God, I might too be an atheist, right? And so I think being able to define those terms and get to what we mean does so much when it comes to being able to share the gospel and sharing what we believe exactly.
Right. And I think that in the spirit of argumentation, some people in their logic have very poor methodology by which they convey that logical truth. They may be true as true can be, and they're logical and they're dry and dramatic, but if they don't have the proper method by which they convey that truth, in other words, the path by which they convey that truth, then they're not going to be very effective either.
Yeah. Before we even, I want to mention this because you just said something there that I think is really important with logic. You pointed out that many times we begin with the wrong premise, right? And but then you still have a logical understanding. Here's, Tony, I think is like where someone could be correct. They do have the right answer, but yet how they got there is actually incorrect.
That's true too.
So, for instance, I hear this all, like abortion is wrong, right? And I believe that statement. I believe you believe that statement. Abortion is wrong. But if you asked somebody, well, why is abortion wrong? And they answered, for instance, well, because God said it's wrong.
Right.
That's not why abortion is wrong. That's not the best answer, right? Because God says it's wrong because it is wrong, right? Because it's the taking of an innocent life in which another human being does not have the right to take the life of an innocent life. That's why abortion is wrong. But yet I would hear that, right? Why, why is abortion wrong? Because the Bible says so. Well, that's not why it's wrong. So I think that's a good example of not only like we have the right answer, we have the truth, right? It is wrong, but they don't have the logical understanding of why it is wrong.
Right.
And so we have to have both. And then that gets us to that next step. To that point, the idea that we need to understand, I think it's a challenge for those of us that, we've been Catholic for 50 years, and in those 50 years, we've always believed in honoring Mary, but we don't understand why. And I know thousands of Catholics that they don't understand why. I mean, they'll accept it on good faith. But I think this is the challenge, to go back and look at the logic. Why does the church teach this? And I think they'll discover some beautiful truths that happen underneath that actually show us and lead us to that conclusion, which is amazing. But then when we're describing those truths to others, having that logic and having that background, that depth to show why we believe that, but then also being able to then make it appealing in the way that we describe it, the way that we demonstrate it, the way that we even argue, just making it simple, I think is a really, really big detail. And I think that right now, obviously, methodology of, means and modes of whether it's, webinars or podcasts or radio or TV, or even just having the sit down discussion with a glass of whiskey or a beer, what's the best way to convey the faith? I think that's a constant discussion that is being done. And how do we break down walls so that we can have that discussion without having a violent emotional response to something that I disagree with? I think that's part of that pathos, is using the logic, but using that logic in a way and manipulating not the truth, but the mode by which we convey that truth. Yeah, pathos is the art of persuasion. But I want to make sure we're clear on this, because I think a lot of times even people think, oh, you were persuaded, i.e., you were like tricked into it.
You were duped.
But that's certainly not what Aristotle would have meant
Absolutely
by that.
not, right?
It's about using language that the person can access, right? So for me, in teaching, I would a lot of times like maybe use a popular movie, right? Or so a movie that I know that most of the teens had seen, right? So hey, you remember this scene in this movie, okay? And then draw some point out of that, right? Or I think of sports, right? Especially in our culture today, sports is so popular. Be able to use something that we all are familiar with in sports and be able to use that to bring them to that new understanding or a deeper understanding.
Right, and sometimes it is that. Sometimes it's using those types of examples, and I think that you and I are both are storytellers by trade. That's what we do. That's how we try to convey deeper truths that are tough to understand, but maybe if you understood it according to this story or that story, I think that that's important. And I just think about the example at the very beginning of the show. And you said, well, what's logic? And, I used a lot of big words, and maybe they were people that were
big.
They were following perfectly. And there were other people who were like, that sounded like a foreign language to me. But
Right.
What did you do? You followed that up by breaking it down those words so that it was an easier, clearer understanding, so that someone could actually have that conversation and be listening and go, oh, I didn't understand what Tony said, but I totally understood what Chris said when he broke it down. That's the point. Are we able to take those logical truths and dissect them a little bit, break them down a little bit, use an example, use a way by which we can explain them or show, or just simply demonstrate, that this is going on. And in doing that, it opens up the door to understanding those truths at a deeper level, both for us, but also for the people we're trying to describe them to.
Yeah. What other things does pathos, entail? This second part of this three part of art of argumentation. What other things does pathos include?
Well, I think that applying it to the person's perspective. In other words, I may not have that same perspective. Take the abortion issue, and you sit there and you say, okay, here's my perspective, but I'm a man, and as a man, they might make the argument, you don't have the right to say that because you're not a woman, you never experienced that. But I can take that and say, but I do have women in my life. I have women in my life who I've been exposed to a lot of people, and a lot, even former students who have come into my classroom and said, I'm pregnant, I don't know what to do, and I loved them. And I go through what that journey is and what that fear is and what all that is, so that I can understand from an emotive perspective. I can identify with the emotion that's going on in there, so that I can demonstrate that it's still a truth that resides there that needs to be adhered to, even though I personally have never experienced that, and I have never, I'm not even in that position because I'm a man, but I've also, so it's taking the emotional part of it and saying, look, we can identify with that, we can understand it, but then we can also apply it in a way using stories, using personal experiences to actually demonstrate that there is something here, that it's not just a cut and dry, merciless logic, but rather one that demonstrates an affection and an emotion and a sympathy or an empathy that really draws out a deeper understanding of that truth that goes beyond just the simple logic.
Yeah. Something else that I always love to see when we discuss logos, pathos, and ethos is examples of this, not just in Christians, but in the Gospels and in Scripture itself. So, for instance, there's this great story of how Paul actually uses this in Acts 17 when he's walking around and he sees this statue to the unknown God. Right, he stops and he points this out to them. That's that attention getting, aspect of pathos. Or I think of when Jesus goes into, and you can even fill us in more about how Paul uses that. But I think of Jesus, the story when I think of Jesus getting people's attention is like when he goes into the temple and he overturns all the money changers.
Right.
That gets people's attention. But to Tony, to me, I think we have an issue today that this is all we have, right? We even have a name for it today in clickbait, right? That someone puts up this title of, a death of something, right? Of a 3-year-old child or whatever. And you go down and it's actually a 3-year-old child didn't die and no one actually died. And it was, a 45-year-old, right? And you're like, what? That was not the story at all. But we see that happen all the time. That
Right.
People are trying to get this. And that is probably, their false attempts of using pathos.
Well, and I'm going to throw something else out there from ancient history, but the Socratic method, the idea that we'll have an open, question-oriented discussion as a group, that we're going to use the Socratic method, which obviously Socrates and Aristotle and Plato coming from the same genre of philosophers, the ancient philosophers. But this Socratic method, or even the questioning method of asking the right questions, listening to what they're saying, but then asking the right questions, is a great way to allow the other person to find the logical, guide them through the syllogism, through asking questions. What is this bird? This is a swan. Is it white? Yes. Are all swans? You're asking the questions to guide them along the way so they can come to that same conclusion. And I think I've been a part of that conversation a countless numbers of times, especially with students, where as they're really questioning things and they're worried about where their faith is, and you can tell that they're just really struggling with things, that you just start asking questions, and they finally come to the conclusion that I need to do this. This is the decision I need to make. And I think that if we do that, then the pathos becomes very simple, because it's allowing them to come to that conclusion instead of trying to shove the truth down their throat. We're allowing them to come to that conclusion, which is much more sustainable and palatable.
Right. I mean, pathos is this art of trying to make it appealing.
Right.
And so many times, perhaps, maybe it's hard for us to make the faith appealing because maybe we struggle with that relationship, that loving relationship with our Lord. Maybe to us, we struggle so much with just an authentic, loving relationship with our Lord that we just simply find it easier to focus on the things we do in our faith. Do you understand what I'm
Right.
saying here? So like, it's easier for me to count how many rosaries I said this week, or how many times I went to mass this week, or it's easier for me to, count the stations of the cross than to deal with this loving God who all he wants is just me and my brokenness. And he wants us to find him in that brokenness and love him and receive his love. But because that's really difficult, we find it that when we go to share the faith, I would say we tend to want to share the practice of the faith itself instead of the person of the faith.
Right.
And yet the desire is to make it appealing. And here to me is like, to make the faith appealing, we just really need to share Jesus, that same love with them. And to me, when I think of that appealing to them, that attention-getting aspect that's kind of where we should be beginning. Not with, how many rosaries or how many times we need to go to Mass in a year or how many times we need to go to confession in a year, but like what the Lord has done for me in my life. Like, I used to be this, and now the Lord has made me this.
Mm-hmm.
This is what... these were the sins I used to fall into, but now he has freed me from this, right? Or I am working on this and I have a faith and a hope that he's going to get me out of this sin. Even though I keep falling, he's going to get me out of it. And to me, that's what, pathos is so much is about, is making this appealing to others. And I think more often than not, Catholics, over certainly the last maybe 100, 150 years, we have made it seem like just a legal system that we're going to, for instance, we're going to make ourselves holy by just working really hard at it. And that's not what our faith is. It's not what Jesus came to do for us. Too many times I feel like that's what we're trying to give to people, and that's just not appealing.
Right. I mean, no one wants. I mean, if you want a list of things to do, you can go join the military. You can get a different
That's a great
job.
one.
You can. I mean, there's just a list of things to do. I mean, who doesn't have a list of things to do? And I just don't want to have another list of obligations, right? And I don't like to be told what to do, but I don't mind being told that I love, that they love me. I don't mind doing things when someone, is trying to show me how much they love me. And if I understand who Christ is in that way, and I can demonstrate that to someone else, and I can communicate how Christ loves me and how that has changed my life to someone else, then all of a sudden the what I'm supposed to do isn't someone commanding me to go to Mass on Sunday, but rather an invitation to fall deeper and deeper in love with Jesus Christ and to celebrate his day in honor and glory. And I think that that's where the pathos really brings us to a real challenge of taking that logic, that simple truth that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, right? I mean, this is a simple John 3:16 truth. But when we give that truth, are we giving that truth in love, or are we giving that truth in duty? Like here are all the duties. Once you accept this truth, here's what you're going to have to do.
Right.
And if we give it in a way that shows that love is manifest through the way that I love them, that's definitely moving us from pathos into ethos, right? That's where I think that this is a simple journey as we talk about how we describe the truth.
Yeah, to me, and again, we can, before we go into the break, I think another great example from this is in the Gospels is the parables. Right, they're making it appealing.
Right.
And I think even in modern day, the story of the prodigal son, the story of going after the lost one over the 99, I think is something that is appealing and that can be shared, or we can share this with anybody. Because the fact is that we are living in a culture today that is more and more unchurched. So the chances of them actually being somebody who heard these parables is not actually as good as we think it is in our mind. So we can actually use these tools that our Lord has given us to make his message that the kingdom is coming for them right now, and use the same parables he used. Use his own pathos.
Right. And the reality is, if excuse me,
You're
I think
excused. Again, I will excuse you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But I think that this is where, Chris, when we talk about pathos, and we talk about like trips to the Holy Land, this is like the ultimate pathos. We get to go there and describe those parables in context of the culture,
the place, yeah.
and the terrain and what's going on and where things are in proximity to one another. I think that this is where, when we talk about the fifth gospel, that the Holy Land comes to life, coming on a pilgrimage, because of the fact that it is using like the ultimate pathos. It's like using a storybook that is like an actual land where we go and we live it out and we talk about it and we understand that, a simple one would be, just this image of Jesus and the lamb over his shoulders, that he's the good shepherd, right? And a lot of people don't realize that good shepherd broke the leg of the sheep in order to save it.
Right.
It broke the leg so that he would have to carry it, so that the sheep then would learn the scent of the shepherd and never leave the shepherd's side, because he would learn the scent of the shepherd, being dependent upon the shepherd, hanging over his shoulder, smelling the shepherd, would all of a sudden have this understanding that this is the shepherd that I need to follow. And I think that a lot of times we just think, oh, it's just a cute lamb over a shepherd's shoulder, but we don't realize that, a lot of times they would break the leg of the sheep if it ran away. And those are, just a simple little story like that, but it gives great context to a greater depth that's there than just simply a lovely story.
Well, I like what you did right there. That was very persuasive, and how you just dropped like the pilgrimage thing. That was nice. Because you know what, Tony, we'll be going back there in January, right? January is the 13th this year.
13th to the 23rd.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we will be going back, and anyone who wants to come with us can experience that, what you just described, and see those sheep and those shepherds out there in the fields. They're still there. Probably not the same ones. Probably not the same sheep.
I'm guessing.
But they're still in the same fields. and you can see them for yourself. If you ever want to check that out, just go to our website, castingnetsministries.com, and scroll down maybe even one little thing, and you'll see the information for the pilgrimage right there. But let's go ahead and take our last break, and we'll be right back to discuss our final part of this, what Aristotle has to teach us, how to communicate truth to others. This is Casting Nets with Tony and Chris. Back to Casting Nets. I am Chris Stewart here with Tony Brandt, and this week's book of the week is The Missionary of Wall Street by Stephen Auth. And I tell you what, we met Steve probably, what was it, about 2 years ago?
Well,
Coming up, maybe
year and a half ago.
Yeah. And we met him. We were speaking at a conference. He was there in attendance, and met him and his wife. And he started talking about these missions. He called them missions that he did on the streets of New York City, down there by Old St. Patrick.
Soho area.
Yeah, the Soho area, which I had no idea where that was. I thought he was talking about Soho, and I was like, is that like in the Caribbean? I had no idea what that was. And he was talking about these stories of how they do these missions in which they try to get people to come into the church and spend some time in prayer, but they also have confession going on. So they try to invite them, hey, would you like to go to confession? How long has it been? And they just have these teams on the streets. And he was sharing these stories with us. And I remember I went and I said, I'm just looking at him. I go, Steve, please tell me you're writing these stories down, because you need to put this in a book. And he goes, yeah, we are. And it's almost done. And so I think it was about, 6-8 months ago, maybe. The book came out again, The Missionary of Wall Street. And it's just, all it is these stories that have happened. Amazing stories. I'm telling you, you need to pick this up. Steve Auth, that's A-U-T-H, The Missionary of Wall Street. And you'll read it in 2-3 days. Tops.
Right. It's a page turner, because it's story after story after story of just absolutely awesome, compelling little conversations that he has with so many people, and the success that he's had. And I think that it's interesting to me because it's not just a matter of, it's called The Missionary of Wall Street for a reason. And,
right.
And part of it is because, right. It's New York City, yes, but it's also Stephen Auth. Steve is he's a major financial guru. He's on Bloomberg TV all the time. He's on
Fox.
He's on Fox with Laura Ingraham. I remember when we went to dinner with him, he was having an interview with Laura Ingraham, before we went to lunch with him that one day. And it was just like, oh, why wouldn't you be having an interview with a major, news network? But he tends to be that type of person. He's actually advised the Trump administration on international business, and runs. I think he's the chief investment officer of the Federalist, I believe, and just an absolutely awesome guy. We're gonna have to have him on the show.
Definitely.
But as a book, this is a great page turner. So if you're looking for something that shows someone who has such knowledge and such wisdom from a financial sector, and his ability to bring that all the way down to meet people in the streets and to try to win their souls for the sake of Christ. If you meet him, he has twice the passion for souls as he does for Wall Street.
Oh, right. Yes.
And it is so evident. But he's also incredibly brilliant. So it's a lot of fun to talk to him.
Yeah, so that's The Missionary of Wall Street, From Managing Money to Saving Souls in the Streets of New York. And for any of the Book of the Weeks, you can check them out in the description on our YouTube page, or you can go to our website, castingnetsministries.com/podcast, and all of them are there. Even in the past, you can go and check out other books of the week, click on them, and get it to your house right there. So that's the Book of the Week, The Missionary of Wall Street.
Okay, so in this series, we're talking about Aristotle. So the first part of it was on logos, logic, the actual ability to describe the truth in a concise, very specific form, but then also to go from there into making that attractive, the art of persuasion, of demonstrating that in an attractive way, in a way that is welcoming and digestible. But then from there going into the ethos, which really is the art of engendering trust. No one really wants to listen to you unless they trust you, and I think that's in the end, that's the game on part of it. You have to have the truth. You have to be articulate and able to convey that truth in a convincing way. But in the end, they have to trust you, and you have to show them that you actually do care about the person. Otherwise, it's just argument for the sake of argument. Anyone can argue both sides of every argument if they're really good.
Yeah, you're one of those people who like to do that.
I do like to argue the opposite side
yes.
of whatever argument.
It's what made you a great teacher, too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But the whole point is the aim is to engender trust so that the person will listen to your argument. I think in today's society, we don't want to listen to the other person's argument.
No.
We just want our words to be said, and in the end, we just want to speak our piece, and we want them to admit that we're right, and we don't want to hear their side of it. And I think that in order,
I'm really good at that.
You're right, that is something you are good at. But in the end, the idea is to engender trust in a way that allows them to know that we actually do care about their argument. We're willing to listen to their argument. We're willing to listen to maybe even their pain, their suffering, whatever's going on, that we actually do care about them. And I think that takes a very specific quality that we can learn to have. Some people have it very naturally, but we can also learn to have, so as to allow the argument to end in a way that's very successful.
Yeah, and this is, to me, a part of this, and there's kind of two parts, right? Kind of a natural part of just ethos, and then I think Christianity, our faith, adds a supernatural element to this. But these are kind of, the natural part of this is kind of no-brainers. I mean, you mentioned one of them, just listening to them, right? But it's also just practical things that your mom should have told you a long time ago, right? Like not interrupting.
Like
what? Stop interrupting, right?
Interrupting cow.
Right. Don't interrupt, right? Let them speak. But not only to not interrupt, but to truly listen. Like, and it's one thing just to be able to, it's one thing, Tony, to not speak, right? But it's another thing to actually listen to where you can articulate back to them what they just said. I know, like, again, you're really great at this. Like, in different relationships we've had, I mean, going back to even our teaching days, you could realize that somebody who we are working with, you would tell me, Chris, look, because like maybe we were getting in a heated discussion with somebody, and you pulled me aside later on and said, Chris, look, really what they just wanted you to do was just to be able to articulate back to them what they were saying, because they don't believe that you understand their point. Which you even told me, Chris, look, I know you understood their point because you went to correct it in this way and this way, but they can't move on because they didn't think you understood their point.
Right. And that's a really big part of it. And I think listening includes an interior processing of what they're saying. So in other words, even though we say we're listening and we're quiet, if I'm articulating the argument against what they're saying right now as they're speaking, and I cannot wait for them to stop so that I can correct them.
Because I don't want to interrupt. Right.
Then I'm not actually listening either. And so I have to listen to what they're saying. And I guess in my mind, I don't just listen to what they're saying. I try to understand why they're saying it. What is it? What is the argument, and where are they? I try to empathize, get into their head from their perspective. Why is this? Why does this seem true to them? And if I can understand that, which means that I'm going to have to respond with a couple of questions. I'm going to have to respond with a couple of questions because I can assume that I understand where they're coming from, but I really just don't know. So I can look at them and say, "Are you saying that because you see it from this perspective?" And I hear people all the time, "No." I'm like, "Okay, no, I really am trying to understand you." So don't argue with me trying to understand you. But the whole point is, are we friendly enough so that they realize that I really am trying to get what they're saying? Because if I start doing that, then their response to me is to try to start to get what I'm saying. They're going to start looking at like, oh, so the reason why you believe you have to go to a church to pray, not have to, but it's preferred for me to go to the Adoration Chapel to pray, is because I actually do believe that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus.
That's right. Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense for me to go to a church to pray if I don't believe in sacred spaces or that the Eucharist is the true presence or anything else. And so I try to help them, get to that point, but I'm also trying to help myself get to their point so that I can better understand. And when we do that, I believe that we become so much more approachable, that people realize that they can come and speak to us. And Chris, you and I, when we were teachers, and I know that we always go back to these stories from teaching days, but there's an approachability to simply loving people. There's an approachability that comes when you don't put yourself out as this super high intellectual, that you don't put yourself out as this gruff, I know everything and you don't know anything and I can out-argue you no matter what. That when we love our students, when we love the people that we're trying to bring around, that we really love them no matter where they are. I don't know, and I've never been able to put my finger on why this person versus that person, but it was like half the students would go to your office and half the students would come to my office, and they would tell us things like, I commit this terrible sin last night with my boyfriend, and what do I do about that? And I'm sitting there thinking, why would you go to your morality teacher who just condemned the sin yesterday in class? Why would you go to that person? Because the way that it was conveyed was out of love, and that person was approachable because of it. If we become approachable, then that ethos of engendering trust, they came because they trusted us. That's why they came. And the reality is, how do we then communicate or demonstrate what kind of pathos can I give right now to help our listeners understand that the art of engendering trust is crucial if we're going to be effective in our evangelization efforts?
Right. I think so much, Tony, they were willing to come because they were interested in what we had to say about whatever situation they're in. And they were interested in what we had to say because they knew we were truly interested in them. Mm-hmm. I know both of us did this so many times where how many, JV games or freshman games, whatever it is, a sport that I didn't even care about. Right? I would go to a volleyball game, right? And
I like volleyball.
Yeah, you do like volleyball. I don't. Although I actually enjoy like some high level Olympic volleyball, but otherwise I really don't find it all that interesting. But I would go because my students were playing. And I tell you what, every time, and I know you experienced this as well, when you went to their game, the next time that student was in the classroom, they were different. Mm-hmm. They had a different interest level in my class. And this is where, Tony, I could never fathom teaching math or English or history. And maybe math teachers really do think, oh, I want all of my students to love math. I don't know if they actually think that or not, because obviously they would surely know some of my students will not love math, and many of my students will not go on to be mathematicians, but some of them will, right? But for us, when we were teaching the faith, I want all my students to love it. And so I have got to make sure to show an interest in them so that they will show an interest in this. Now, for those of you that are not teachers and you're just in the secular world, doing your job, whatever it is, how can this play out? I think of things like to show interest into others. Like, maybe you hear them talk about some movie or some television series, whether it's on, real TV or Netflix or Amazon. You hear them talk about it, and maybe you've never seen it. You know what? Go watch it. It's a simple thing. Maybe there could be things that I would never watch that, or I might be worried about the moral conclusion of that. Well, maybe you'll have to skip through some things, but at least you're going to be able to then bring that up in a conversation to show that you were interested in what they were interested.
Right.
And you're making that connection to them.
Right, and when we do make that connection, it means a lot, and it makes the reality of their life really attainable. It's something that we identify with, and that we can then not just empathize but sympathize with their position or with their argument. I think that's really, really important, and I think that's an incredible point. Whether it's a book they've read or even just trying to get into their line of thinking, their understanding, so that you can then, I don't want to put anybody in danger, right? You don't want to go down too far down the rabbit hole, and if you don't feel strong enough in your faith to go down that way. But I think that it's really important for us to realize that if we walk with them, meet them where they're at in the mud and the muck, that we can walk with them out. If people wouldn't have been that approachable and that humble enough to do that with me, I don't know where I'd be. So the reality is, we're just trying to be not high and mighty. I understand that there are certain truths, and I guess I'm kind of moving to this direction. We need to pray. We need to fall in love with our Lord. We need to ask for those supernatural gifts, those incredible fruits of the Holy Spirit, of understanding, counsel, knowledge, all those things. But I think that my biggest issue, and I'm going to kind of wrap my part of it up here with this. I think my biggest issue is when we have people out there that are devout. They love Jesus, they love the church, they're praying every day, but they're so closed off. They're so closed off to listening and trying to understand where that other person is, to the point where they condemn them for silly little things, maybe serious things, but they have no right to condemn them regardless.
Right.
And they're not willing to meet them where they're at. They're just, look at me high and mighty on my little pedestal, living my incredibly righteous, beautiful life, and look at all those weak little peasants down there that will never love Jesus like I love Jesus. That drives me insane. And when I see it, it makes me sit there and react as though maybe it's the way that Jesus saw the Pharisees, the way that he saw these people that acted like they were so righteous. And I just don't. We see it all the time, Chris, and we see it all the time. And I hope that if I ever am acting like that, or and I know that I probably have here and there, but I appreciate it when people call me out on it, because I don't want to be that guy.
Oh, I'll let you know.
I'm sure you will.
And I'll use, and I will use logos, pathos, and
ethos for it. All right.
To let you know. To me, I just, my closing thought is, St. Paul said it in such a beautiful way in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says, I have become all things to all men. And I love this part, so that some might be saved, right? I've become all things to all men just so that some might be saved. Can we take that effort, both on just a natural plane and on a supernatural plane, just so that some might be saved? Can we use this beautiful art that Aristotle has given us to use that logos, that pathos, and ethos, so that the faith can be attractive to others? We really hope that you enjoyed this show. If you have, we ask you to please share it, like it, share it with others. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel or to iTunes or Spotify, wherever you are taking this podcast in, and share it with others. We're going to be here every week for you. This is Casting Nets with Tony and Chris. Remember to keep casting your nets out into the deep.